Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Wednesday, November 19th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. A quick mention before we start about our special series at Times of Israel, documentary films that can be watched from home with English subtitles. After each film is done being watched, you can ask questions directly to the filmmakers in exclusive Q&R webinars that we host. It's called DocuNation, and it's available to members of our reader support group, the Times of Israel community. For more info, just go to timesofisrael.com/films. That's timesofisrael.com/films. So good morning again. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Jacob, how are you?
Good morning, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Good to be back with you as well. It is day 775 of the war. Following the UN Security Council vote on Monday endorsing U.S. President Donald Trump's broad Gaza plan, the president hosted Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman at the White House. We'll talk about elements of the Security Council vote and MBS, as the Crown Prince is often called, about his visit, as well as Jacob's interview with Fadwa Barghouti, the wife of prominent Palestinian prisoner Marwan Barghouti. All of that in just a moment. Stay with us. Okay, so Jacob, let's talk about the MBS visit at the White House, which is obviously a very big deal. Starting with the headline, one of your headlines in our live blog, in which President Trump designated MBS and designated Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally. And that is a pretty major step. Why don't we take it from there and see what else you can tell us about the MBS visit and dinner?
Yes, so Saudi Arabia was looking through this trip to elevate the relationship that it has with the United States, and in particular in the area of defense guarantees, meaning that if Saudi Arabia comes under attack, that the U.S. will come to its defense, kind of like the way that Qatar managed to leverage its relationship with the U.S. to secure a similar defense guarantee. And Trump decides to announce during a dinner where he's hosting MBS on Tuesday night that he's going to give Saudi Arabia the same status that actually Joe Biden gave to Qatar in the previous administration, which is to consider them a non-NATO major ally. So it's a way to elevate the status of Saudi Arabia in the eyes of the U.S. a little bit higher than some of the other relationships that Washington has with its various allies. But the fact that this is also going to come with various defense guarantees and sale of important weapons that the Saudis are really been looking to get, there was definitely hope in Israel that all of these goodies that the U.S. was giving to Saudi Arabia would be conditioned on an agreement from Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with the Jewish state. But ultimately, it seems like the U.S. decided that there was more to gain by moving ahead with these gestures to the Saudi Arabia and all these different defense guarantees because of what the Saudis are willing to give the U.S. already now, which is simply massive amounts of investment. If there was talk of $600 billion of investment during Trump's visits to Saudi Arabia several months ago, MBS announces in the Oval Office that it's actually going to be $1 trillion. Whether that actually pans out is another thing, but that's what they're talking about. And I think that's enough to entice Trump to forego some of the concerns that Israel has regarding not getting normalization. It's still something that Trump wants, and he brings it up during the meeting, both before and afterwards and in public. But it didn't seem to be too bothered by MBS's response, which is that we would like to join the Abraham Accords. We want peace with Israel, but we also want to secure a clear path toward a two-state solution, something that we've heard the Saudis say quite a few times over the past months and years now.
So did the mentions of Israel go any farther than that, or that was basically what he said, and that's as far as it went in terms of their conversations during the visit?
I think one thing that MBS did say regarding this issue that maybe you can read into a little bit, and I've spoken with a U.S. official who said that there is some truth to it. He talks about that we want to start a process to get us into a better place, meaning that we might not be ready to normalize relations with Israel now, but we are open to the idea. We want to be part of the Abraham Accords, he says, and we're going to start a process to allow us to get there. The issue is that still what they're asking for is something on the Palestinian front that I think would have been difficult for the Netanyahu government to give before October 7th, and now when we're talking after October 7th, it's almost a fantasy to the notion that they're going to take any sort of step, even rhetorical, on the Palestinian front. I mean, if you think just in the past few days how much there's been pushback over any mention of Palestinian statehood, as theoretical as it might be in this UN Security Council resolution, the idea of actually having to take steps seems way out of the realm of possibility. I think what the Saudis are hoping is maybe there'll be a different government in Israel, and then they'll be more open to working towards this issue. And since we're entering an election year, maybe the stars will align as far as they're concerned.
Before we get to the UN Security Resolution, which is something that you also were covering yesterday, let's talk about the F-35s. There was also something of a deal that was agreed upon between MBS and President Trump.
Right. So there was a lot of concern in Israel also on this issue. I think not principled opposition to Saudis receiving the F-35s, but again, they were hoping that it would be conditioned on normalization with Israel. What's interesting is on this issue that it's not only a concern from the Israeli point of view, but also legally, Congress has passed legislation that requires the U.S. to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge, the QME. And that is something that if you just simply give the Saudis the same plane that Israel has, which is supposed to be the top-notch F-35 plane, then you're not preserving Israel's qualitative military edge. However, Trump has asked about this and says basically, well, Israel and Saudi Arabia are both great allies, and we think that they should have both top-notch military equipment, and that the planes that we're planning to sell the Saudis will actually be quite similar to what Israel gets. So it doesn't seem he's too concerned about that. We'll see if Congress puts up any sort of opposition, but it's unlikely that the Republicans are going to go against their party or their party's president on this, and that the Democrats have enough to sway, given that they're in the minority currently.
Do you think there's going to be an expression of surprise from Netanyahu or from the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. to President Trump or to his administration about this?
It's a fair question. I think that the Netanyahu has put all of his eggs in the Trump basket, and I don't think he's in a real position to be pushing back. The IDF did issue a formal opposition to it. I think there was some letter that was passed along to the Pentagon on the IDF's behalf. But ultimately, I think this is a political decision that the leadership also, I mean, during the Abraham Accords, there was concern about the UAE getting the F-35s. Ultimately, Israel was not able to push back and prevent it from happening. What actually has prevented it from happening has been bureaucratic issues regarding technology and the F-35s that the U.S. is concerned reaching China. I think there'll be some similar concerns regarding Saudi Arabia accessing this technology. But even if the deal is signed, it's going to take years for the Saudis actually to have access to these planes. It's not going to be happening tomorrow.
Okay. Circling back to the UN Security Council. So the U.S. garnered support for its 20-point proposal, its broad Gaza peace plan. And one of the things that you note in your piece about this is the hardest part will be convincing countries to provide troops to ensure that the Gaza Strip is demilitarized. So let's talk a little bit, though, more broadly about the vote and what it actually means to have the UN support for Trump's plan for Gaza.
So the vote gives this board of peace that's envisioned by the 20-point Trump plan, this board of peace that will be chaired by Trump, an international mandate to be in charge of redeveloping Gaza for the next 2 years, or until the Palestinian Authority completes its reform program. But there's this specific 2-year mandate that's listed in there. And they also note that when that transition happens, then the conditions may finally be in place, maybe, for a credible pathway to a two-state solution, something that Israel didn't like seeing in there, but it's still not very definitive. I think it was language that was needed to get some of the various countries on board. But basically, the resolution also authorizes the Board of Peace to establish a Palestinian technocratic government that will manage the daily affairs in Gaza. And then also critically establishes this ISF, this International Security Stabilization Force, which will help coordinate with Israel and Egypt to secure the borders of Gaza and the humanitarian aid that enters the Strip. It will help with the gradually replacing the IDF in Gaza, something that I think Israel is quite antsy about. But most critically for Israel, what Israel did want to see was it will help ensure the process of demilitarization. And it gets into specific ways that it will go about doing that. And I think that's what's going to be a real heavy lift to try to get countries to get on actually board. It's one thing to vote to establish this forum. It's another to actually contribute troops to it when there's recognition that you're going to have to be taking on some pretty heavy tasks of possibly going to war or not, to battle against Hamas in order to take away their weapons, something that Hamas has said it's not intending to do. Still, I think it does provide this resolution some momentum for the ceasefire effort after it's been under a bit of strain in recent weeks as Hamas has continued to remain in power and Israel is threatening to resume the war in order to quash Hamas. But it does, again, we're going to have to see whether or not there's any countries that are willing to join. I think it was notable that Mike Waltz, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, singled out Indonesia and Azerbaijan as countries that could be part of the force. So the fact that he's naming them does indicate that I don't think he would have been naming those countries had he not gotten some assurances that they would be willing to do so. So you do have potentially two countries that have been willing, and Indonesia in the past has talked about 20,000 troops that would be willing to send under the condition that it would be more under peacekeeping and not peace enforcing, which is what this resolution talks about. So we'll have to see what happens on that front. But just looking at the reactions was also quite noteworthy to see. On the one hand, of course, you had Hamas condemning it because they don't like this idea of having a foreign force in Gaza. But the PA, I think, is just incredibly weakened that is looking for any sort of support from the Trump administration. And despite that it's been totally sidelined by this board of peace, that it can't even go enter Gaza for 2 years, they actually welcomed it. And Israel, notably, was one country that actually didn't really take a stance, even though this is all about something that's very relevant to Israel. The Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, just issued a statement basically talking about the importance of demilitarization. And then you had Prime Minister Netanyahu the next day waiting until quite a long time afterwards to issue a statement in English that applauded Trump without saying what he was applauding Trump for, and then just talked about the importance of the Trump peace plan and that it's a good thing. So sort of welcoming it, but not really directly. I think it was against this major blow up over the weekend about this inclusion of Palestinian statehood language in the resolution and a joint statement that was issued with the U.S. and other countries that talked about a more definitive pathway to a Palestinian state. It's all over rhetoric, over a statement that's non-binding, but that's how Israel chose to look at it. But still, I think it was noteworthy that you had this internationalization of the conflict happening, something that Israel's tried to push back against from happening for many, many years, that they feel that we shouldn't be allowing foreign powers into the territories that we're trying to maintain our control over, be it in Gaza or the West Bank. And now all of a sudden we have a major international force that's been given a very broad mandate to govern Gaza and secure Gaza without a lot of, hopefully, I guess you could say, some cooperation from Israel. But for right now, I think there's very skittish about the idea of sending all these different foreign powers into the Strip. And I think it was notable that the U.S. was able to get all these countries on board despite a lot of these apprehensions, be it from Hamas, be it from Israel, of course, and Russia and China, who weren't thrilled about the resolution, but still didn't block it and chose to abstain. So it is a pretty big diplomatic victory for the Trump administration.
Right. So the formalization of this diplomatic process at the UN, essentially, that's sort of like the final way to look at it. Okay. Let's take a quick break, Jacob. When we're back, let's talk about your interview with Fadwa Barghouti, the wife of prominent Palestinian prisoner Marwan Barghouti. The first, I believe, a real scoop for you and just to hear what she had to say. So stay with us. So, Jacob, first time that Fadwa Barghouti has spoken to Israeli press. Her husband, prominent Palestinian prisoner Marwan Barghouti, has been in prison since 2002. And clearly she feels that something is shifting. I would imagine that she was willing to consider being interviewed by a member of the Israeli press. So tell us about your conversation and what she had to say.
Yeah, so this interview was against the backdrop of the deal that came together in Gaza last month. And 2 days after this Gaza ceasefire hostage deal went into place, on October 15th, President Trump sits down with Time magazine for a lengthy interview about the deal and other parts of his administration. And he's asked about Marwan Barghouti as a potential future leader of the Palestinian Authority. And he says, well, actually, I've just been asked about this issue 15 minutes before I sat down for this interview. And I'm actually going to be making a decision on this very soon. And there was no elaboration given from the White House, but it definitely revived a discussion about Marwan Barghouti's potential release after we had assumed that this issue had been put to bed, given that the prisoner swap had been completed. The hostages have been freed. All the prisoners who would be released had all the prisoners had been released as well, and Marwan Barghouti wasn't on that list. But with this comment from Trump, I've been looking into whether or not the U.S. has actually been behind sort of efforts to pursue his release, why that is, why they feel that it's worthwhile, and why other countries have been pushing for this as well. I'm hoping to report a little bit more on this, but in the meantime, what I wanted to do was try to reach out to the Barghouti family and see what their response is. And we had a pretty lengthy discussion over 2 hours with Barghouti's wife Fadwa. And just a little bit of background on who Marwan is. He is a former, I guess you could say current in some ways, Fatah leader, which is the secular ultra-nationalist Palestinian, which is the secular nationalist Palestinian movement. It's currently led by Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority. Barghouti was also an elected member of the Palestinian parliament. And in 2004, he was convicted of having helped plan several attacks during the Second Intifada that were deadly, and he was convicted and sentenced to five life sentences and plus 40 years behind bars. So for the rest of his life, he's supposed to be for the rest of his life, he's supposed to be in jail. For his part, he has denied the charges against him, and he's actually even refused to present a defense during the case that was very well publicized. He argued that doing so would be legitimizing Israel's charging of a Palestinian parliament member. But he's been in prison ever since. I think his notoriety is expanded since his imprisonment. He's launched hunger strikes that made a lot of waves several years ago. And each time there's a deal for different Israeli hostages, his name is always mentioned and passed over because I think in Israel he's seen as this prominent leader who's got the ability to arguably unify Palestinians. Some in the Israeli security establishment or in the political world see him as a continued security threat, and therefore have not been willing to release him, even though have released people who have been charged with much more severe crimes than Barghouti. But basically in this interview, Fadwa makes the case, of course, for his release, arguing that while he does have this principled approach to supporting the idea of resistance against Israeli military rule, even legitimizing violence against Israeli soldiers. At the same time, she says that he believes in the two-state solution, and he has the unique ability to unify both the Hamas and Fatah and other Palestinian factions, which will be critical, even if Israel doesn't like everything that he says. The idea that he's able to unify all Palestinians, that will make him a much more legitimate leader, a strong leader that is capable of actually reaching a deal with Israel, because she says he does believe in a two-state solution on the 1967 lines. So she makes the case. She talks about how he's been mistreated in prison and beaten 4 times since October 7th. He's been in solitary confinement during that time. We haven't really seen him in many years, except for a video in August with Itamar Ben-Gvir posting it and showing him kind of mocking and lecturing Barghouti. And in that video, he looked much more frail than we've seen him in many years. So she says time could be running out on this real opportunity that, while makes some Israelis feel uncomfortable, I think she argues is actually a real opportunity for peace, and someone that we should be taking seriously. And it seems like there are some people not only in the U.S. but definitely in the international community. And I reported a little bit a month or so ago about Ron Lauder, a very prominent Jewish American community leader who's also advocated for his release because he views Barghouti as someone who is uniquely capable of advancing a two-state solution. And it'll be interesting in the coming weeks following the story whether or not more of these waves are made about Barghouti, and just because there's not another hostage deal on the offing, whether Trump could actually call for a pardon for Barghouti, just like he's calling for a pardon for Prime Minister Netanyahu. It seems pretty far-fetched now, but I do think that there's some quiet diplomatic negotiations been going on about Barghouti as in the past. I think I wouldn't be surprised if that picks up again in the coming months.
Okay. Interesting. Thanks, that. I'm curious, Fatma Barghouti, who is an attorney herself, obviously I imagine this is what she's been doing for the last 20-something years, is pushing for his release. What was her manner like in speaking to you? Obviously, I imagine you spoke over Zoom or the phone.
Yeah, we spoke over Zoom. I would say she was calm. I think she's because she's been doing this for many years at this point, she's very media savvy and knows how to present her case, depending on the audience. One of her goals definitely was trying to humanize Barghouti and talking about him as a father and a grandfather and a husband. And it was, I would say, a challenge. Thinking about how I'm going to be presenting this to an Israeli audience where I don't think there's interest in someone like this being humanized, but at the same time trying to present a character who's A, complex, and B, who is someone that Israel could well be dealing with, if not as a political leader, but also someone who is an influencer in the Palestinian political arena for years to come, whether he's out of jail or not.
Right. I would imagine so. Okay. I think it is time to call it for today's daily briefing. Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
For sure. And thanks to you for listening to the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. As always, any comments you might have about this or other episodes, you can always drop us an email at podcast@timesvisual.com. Until next time, take care and be well, and see you soon.